Why would a simple fast food order lead to a federal investigation that would destroy one woman's life forever? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the nearly empty burger joint, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. It was 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, that dead zone between lunch and dinner when time seems to crawl and patience runs thin. Behind the counter, Sandra Mitchell leaned against the register, her eyes glazed with the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from too many double shifts and too little appreciation. Her name tag hung crooked, the plastic scratched and faded from years of wear. She was 43 years old, a single mother of two, and she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The door chimed as a man walked in. He wore a plain gray hoodie and jeans, unremarkable in every way except for the deliberate slowness of his movements. He approached the counter with his hands in his pockets, his face neutral, unreadable. Sandra didn't bother to straighten up. She'd seen 1,000 customers like him, or so she thought. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone flat, bordering on hostile. No greeting, no smile, just raw impatience delivered like a slap across the face. The man blinked once, twice, then looked up at the menu board as if he hadn't already memorized every item before walking through that door. Sandra let out an audible sigh, rolling her eyes with theatrical exaggeration. "Come on, I don't have all day. Some of us actually work for a living." The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll have a number 3, he said quietly, his voice steady and measured. "No pickles, extra onions." Sandra punched the order into the register with aggressive stabs of her finger. "That'll be $8.47. The man reached for his wallet, but his hand fumbled slightly, and a few coins scattered across the counter. Sandra made no move to help. Instead, she crossed her arms and glared at him as if he'd personally ruined her entire day. "Real smooth," she muttered, loud enough for him to hear. "You gonna pick those up, or just leave a mess for me to deal with?" Something flickered in the man's eyes then, something cold and calculating, but his expression remained calm. He gathered the coins slowly, deliberately, taking his time in a way that seemed to irritate Sandra even more. When he finally handed her the exact change, their eyes met for just a moment. In that brief exchange, a decision was made, though Sandra had no idea what storm she'd just invited into her life. "Your order will be ready in a few minutes," she said, turning away dismissively. The man nodded and moved to wait by the pickup counter, pulling out his phone. His fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, typing, scrolling, documenting. Sandra didn't notice. She was already complaining to her co-worker in the back, her voice carrying through the kitchen despite her attempt at a whisper. Another entitled customer who thinks the world revolves around him. I'm so sick of these people. What Sandra didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the man in the grey hoodie wasn't just another customer. His name was Marcus Chen, and he was a federal agent working undercover for the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. For the past 3 months, he'd been investigating a network of fast food franchises suspected of wage theft, illegal labor practices, and systematic mistreatment of employees. This particular location had been flagged multiple times in anonymous complaints. Marcus wasn't here for a burger. He was here to build a case. But something had shifted in those few minutes at the counter. The way Sandra had treated him, the casual cruelty in her voice, the complete absence of basic human decency, it had triggered something beyond his professional mandate. Marcus had dealt with rude service before. It came with the territory. But there was something different about this, something personal in the way Sandra had looked at him, as if he were beneath her, unworthy of even the slightest courtesy. It reminded him of every bully who'd made his childhood miserable, every authority figure who'd dismissed him before he'd had a chance to prove himself. The order came up and Sandra shoved the bag across the counter without a word. Marcus took it, checked the contents with deliberate care, and then looked up at her. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but pointed. Sandra didn't respond. She was already looking past him, as if he'd ceased to exist the moment the transaction was complete. Marcus walked out, the door chiming behind him, and sat in his car in the parking lot. He didn't eat the burger. Instead, he made a phone call. "Yeah, it's me. I need you to pull everything we have on employee Sandra Mitchell at location 774. Everything. Employment history, social media, financial records, the works. And I want surveillance set up by tomorrow morning." There was a pause on the other end, a question asked. Marcus's response was cold and clinical. "Let's just say I have reason to believe she might be involved in the larger operation. Call it an instinct." It was a lie, of course. Marcus knew it was a lie. But he also knew how to justify it, how to make it sound reasonable, how to fold personal vendetta into professional duty until even he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. By the time he hung up, he'd already convinced himself that Sandra deserved whatever was coming. After all, people who treated others with such contempt usually had something to hide. He was just doing his job. He was just being thorough. 3 days later, Sandra's world began to unravel. It started small. A visit from a health inspector who found violations that hadn't existed the week before. Then came the audit, random they said, routine they said, but somehow it focused exclusively on the shifts Sandra managed, the cash deposits she'd handled, the inventory report she'd signed off on. Discrepancies appeared in the records, tiny at first, but growing with each review. Sandra tried to explain, tried to defend herself, but her words fell on deaf ears. The franchise owner needed a scapegoat, someone to blame when the federal investigation finally went public, and Sandra had just volunteered herself with her attitude and her carelessness. Marcus watched it all unfold from a distance, his reports carefully worded, his evidence meticulously arranged. He told himself he was serving justice, protecting workers, exposing corruption. And in some twisted way, perhaps he was. But late at night, alone in his apartment, he couldn't shake the image of Sandra's face, the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of a life lived on the edge of survival. He'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. And as the investigation deepened and the charges mounted, he began to wonder if he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. The unraveling came faster than even Marcus had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, Sandra was suspended pending investigation. Within 3, she was terminated for gross negligence and suspected embezzlement. The local news picked up the story, a brief segment about franchise fraud that mentioned her name just once, but once was enough. In a small town, once was everything. Sandra sat in her apartment on a Thursday morning, the eviction notice trembling in her hands. The paper was crisp and official, stamped with red ink that seemed to bleed across the page like an open wound. Her 2 children, Emma and Jacob, were at school, blissfully unaware that their mother had spent the previous night crying in the bathroom with the shower running to mask the sound. The bills were piled on the kitchen table, a mountain of envelopes she couldn't bring herself to open. Electricity, water, car insurance, medical bills from Jacob's asthma treatment, each one a reminder of how quickly security could dissolve into chaos. She replayed that Tuesday afternoon in her mind obsessively, like a film stuck on repeat. The man in the grey hoodie, the scattered coins, her sharp words that now felt like bullets she'd fired at her own future. She'd been tired, yes. Overworked, absolutely. But that didn't excuse cruelty, and somewhere in the fog of her desperation, Sandra understood that she'd brought this on herself. What she didn't understand was the scope of it, the systematic precision with which her life was being dismantled. It felt too coordinated, too thorough to be mere consequence. It felt personal. Marcus sat in a conference room downtown, surrounded by fellow agents and legal advisors, reviewing the case file. The investigation had expanded beyond anyone's initial projections. What started as a probe into wage violations had uncovered a network of fraud involving multiple franchise locations, falsified records, and systematic employee exploitation. Sandra's name appeared throughout the documents, always peripheral, never central, but damning nonetheless. She'd signed off on inventory reports that didn't match deliveries. She'd processed cash deposits that couldn't be accounted for. On paper, she looked guilty of at least complicity, possibly more. But Marcus knew something the others didn't. He knew that Sandra hadn't created those discrepancies. The franchise owner, a man named Gerald Hoskins, had been manipulating records for years, using his managers as unwitting shields. Sandra had simply signed what she was told to sign, trusted what she was told to trust. She was a victim being framed as a perpetrator, and Marcus had provided the framework for that framing. His initial report, filed in a moment of petty vindictiveness, had set the tone for everything that followed. Now, watching his colleagues build a case that would likely end with Sandra facing criminal charges, he felt the first real tremors of guilt. "She's the weak link," said Agent Patricia Reeves, tapping a pen against the table. "She'll flip on Hoskins if we offer her a deal. Single mother, no resources, facing felony charges. She'll take whatever we give her." The others nodded in agreement. It was sound strategy, the kind of prosecutorial pressure that closed cases and advanced careers. Marcus said nothing. He stared at Sandra's employee photo clipped to the file, her tired eyes looking back at him across time and circumstance, and felt something crack inside his chest. That evening he drove to Sandra's apartment complex. He didn't know what he intended to do, didn't have a plan beyond the vague impulse to see her, to understand what he'd helped create. The building was run down, paint peeling from the exterior walls, a flickering light in the hallway that cast everything in sickly yellow. He sat in his car across the street, watching the window of her second-floor unit. The curtains were drawn, but he could see the glow of a television through the thin fabric. He imagined her inside, surrounded by the debris of her collapsing life, and wondered if she was thinking about him, the rude customer who'd somehow become the catalyst for catastrophe. Sandra was indeed thinking about him, though not in the way Marcus imagined. She'd been going through her own receipts and records, trying to build some kind of defense, when she found the transaction from that Tuesday afternoon. She'd pulled the security footage from her personal phone, a habit she'd developed after a previous customer complaint. The video quality was poor, shot from an awkward angle behind the register, but it captured the encounter. Watching it now, Sandra saw herself through objective eyes and flinched at what she witnessed. The contempt in her posture, the dismissiveness in her gestures, the casual cruelty that had become so normalized she hadn't even recognized it as wrong. But she also saw something else. The man's face, briefly visible when he looked up at the menu. The calculated way he'd fumbled his change, as if testing her reaction. The phone in his hand at the pickup counter, angled just slightly toward her. It was subtle, possibly nothing, but Sandra had spent 20 years in service industry trenches, and she'd developed instincts about people. This man hadn't been a regular customer. He'd been evaluating her, documenting her, and she'd failed his test spectacularly. She did what any desperate person would do in the digital age. She started searching. Marcus Chen, Department of Labor. It took 3 hours and a dozen search variations, but she found him. A professional photo from a government website, an article about a wage theft task force, a brief mention in a trade publication about undercover operations in the food service industry. Her hands went numb as the pieces fell into place. She'd been rude to a federal agent, and now her entire life was evidence in a case she didn't understand. The next morning, Sandra did something unexpected. She hired a lawyer. Not a good lawyer, she couldn't afford that, but a young public defender named Michael Torres, who took her case pro bono because something about her story bothered him. Michael was 29, idealistic, and still believed the system could be bent toward justice if you pushed hard enough. He listened to Sandra's account, watched the security footage, and immediately recognized what she'd missed. This wasn't about wage theft or embezzlement. This was about retaliation disguised as investigation. "When did the violation start appearing?" he asked, spreading documents across his cluttered desk. Sandra thought back. "About a week after that Tuesday. The health inspector, the audit, all of it came right after." Michael nodded slowly, making notes. "And before that? Any indication you were being investigated?" Sandra shook her head. "Nothing. I'd been working there for 8 years, never even a written warning." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "They're using you. Someone wanted a scapegoat and you made yourself an easy target." He filed a motion for discovery, demanding all investigative records related to Sandra's case. It was a long shot, the kind of procedural move that usually got buried in bureaucracy, but Michael had a friend in the federal public defender's office who owed him a favor. 2 weeks later, a file arrived. It was heavily redacted, black bars covering names and dates, but one detail remained visible. The initial report that had triggered the focused investigation of Sandra Mitchell had been filed 3 days after her encounter with the customer. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Marcus received a call from his supervisor on a rainy Monday afternoon. "We have a problem with the Mitchell case," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Her attorney is alleging retaliatory investigation. He's got timeline evidence, and he's threatening to go public." Marcus felt his blood run cold. That's ridiculous. The investigation was already underway. She was part of a larger probe. His supervisor sighed. "Yes, but your report is what escalated her from peripheral to primary. And the timing looks bad, Marcus. Really bad. Please tell me there's nothing to this." Marcus wanted to lie. He'd built his career on careful deception, on maintaining cover stories and false identities, on saying whatever was necessary to close a case. But sitting in his office, rain streaking down the windows, the weight of Sandra's ruined life pressing against his conscience, he found he couldn't do it. "She was rude to me," he said quietly. "I was undercover, and she was incredibly rude. I let it influence my judgment." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity. When his supervisor finally spoke, her voice was ice. "You need to fix this. Now. But some things, once broken, cannot be fixed." Sandra's case had already attracted attention from advocacy groups monitoring law enforcement overreach. The local news that had briefly mentioned her name was now investigating the investigation itself. Questions were being raised about the use of undercover operations in low-wage workplaces, about the power dynamics between federal agents and vulnerable workers, about what happens when personal grievance masquerades as professional duty. Marcus watched his carefully constructed case collapse like a house of cards, each revelation exposing another layer of his own misconduct. He went to Sandra's apartment again, but this time he knocked on the door. She answered after a long pause, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people who'd been trapped in roles neither had chosen, connected by a moment of cruelty that had metastasized into mutual destruction. "I know who you are," Sandra said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded. "I know. I came to apologize." Sandra laughed, a broken sound without humor. "Apologize? You destroyed my life because I was rude to you. What kind of apology covers that?" Marcus had no answer because there was no answer. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, weaponized his authority in service of his ego, and now they were both paying the price. He was facing disciplinary action, possible termination, maybe even criminal charges for official misconduct. Sandra was facing eviction, unemployment, and the permanent stain of being labeled a thief in a town where everyone knew everyone. Two lives derailed by a 60-second interaction that neither could take back. "I want to make this right," Marcus said, though even as the words left his mouth, he understood how inadequate they were. Sandra looked at him with something like pity. "You can't. That's what you don't understand. You can't put spilled milk back in the glass." She started to close the door, then paused. "But maybe you can do one thing. Tell the truth. All of it. Not for me, but because someone needs to stop this from happening to someone else." Marcus sat in his car outside the Department of Labor building the next morning, engine running, heat blasting against the November cold. His resignation letter was folded in his jacket pocket, typed the night before in a haze of insomnia and shame. But resignation felt too easy, too clean. It was an exit that allowed him to slink away with his pension intact, his reputation bruised but not destroyed. Sandra didn't have that option. She couldn't resign from the consequences he'd set in motion. She had to live them, breathe them, watch her children's faces as she explained why they were moving again, why Christmas would be smaller this year, why Mommy couldn't find work anymore. He pulled out his phone and opened the voice recorder app. His hand hovered over the red button for a long moment, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened screen. Federal agents didn't confess. They didn't break rank. They certainly didn't record themselves admitting to misconduct that could end careers and trigger investigations. But Marcus was beyond career considerations now. He pressed record. "My name is Marcus Chen, Special Agent with the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, badge number 74329. On October 3rd of this year, I initiated a targeted investigation of Sandra Mitchell, a shift manager at Burger Haven Location 774, not because of credible evidence of wrongdoing, but because she was rude to me during an undercover interaction. I manipulated case files to justify expanded surveillance. I emphasized minor discrepancies in reports while knowing the franchise owner Gerald Hoskins was responsible for systemic fraud. I allowed my personal feelings to compromise a federal investigation, and in doing so, I destroyed an innocent woman's life." He paused, his voice catching. "This statement is voluntary and made without coercion. Everything I've said is true." He sent the recording to 3 people: his supervisor, the U.S. attorney handling the case, and Michael Torres, Sandra's lawyer. Then he turned off his phone, stepped out of the car, and walked into the building. By noon, his badge and weapon were on his supervisor's desk. By evening, the story was breaking on local news. By midnight, it had gone national. The response was immediate and polarizing. Social media erupted in a civil war of opinions. Some saw Marcus as a villain, a corrupt agent who'd abused his power to punish a working-class woman for a moment of rudeness. Others saw him as surprisingly honest, a rare example of accountability in a system that usually protected its own. Still, others saw the whole situation as a parable about civility, arguing that Sandra had brought consequences upon herself by treating a stranger with contempt. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any single narrative could contain. Sandra watched the coverage from her sister's couch, where she and her children were temporarily staying. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Advocacy groups wanted her to be a spokesperson. True crime podcasters wanted exclusive rights to her story. Everyone wanted a piece of her trauma, neatly packaged and ready for consumption. She ignored them all, focused instead on Emma's math homework and Jacob's breathing treatments, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy as the world debated her worth as a human being. Michael Torres was working 18-hour days, suddenly representing the center of a media firestorm. He'd filed motions to dismiss all charges against Sandra, citing Marcus's confession as proof of investigative misconduct. The U.S. Attorney's Office was in chaos, trying to salvage what remained of the larger case against Gerald Hoskins while distancing themselves from Marcus's actions. But the damage was done. Defense attorneys for Hoskins were already arguing that the entire investigation was tainted, that if one agent could manipulate evidence out of personal vendetta, how could any evidence be trusted? Marcus, meanwhile, had disappeared. He'd given his statement, resigned his position, and vanished from public view. He wasn't hiding exactly, but he'd moved to a small cabin 2 hours north, a place his grandfather had left him years ago that he'd never had time to visit. The cabin had no internet, no cell service, just a landline that he never answered, and a wood stove that demanded constant attention. He spent his days chopping wood and his nights staring at the fire, trying to understand the sequence of choices that had led him from decorated federal agent to cautionary tale. But isolation couldn't stop the reckoning. The Department of Labor launched an internal investigation, reviewing every case Marcus had worked in his 12-year career. How many other investigations had been tainted by personal bias? How many other lives had been upended by an agent more interested in revenge than justice? The review would take months, possibly years, and Marcus knew that his confession had opened a door that could never be closed. He'd meant to take responsibility for one incident. Instead, he'd called into question the integrity of an entire system. 3 weeks after Marcus's confession, Sandra received an unexpected visitor. Agent Patricia Reeves stood at her sister's door, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes, her federal credentials visible but not prominently displayed. "I'm not here officially," she said when Sandra answered. "I'm here because I need you to understand something." Sandra considered closing the door, but curiosity won. She invited Patricia inside, offered coffee that was declined, and waited. Patricia sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, choosing her words carefully. "I worked with Marcus for 6 years. He was one of the best agents I've ever known. Thorough, dedicated, incorruptible, or so I thought. What he did to you was wrong, unforgivable, but it's also completely out of character." She looked up, meeting Sandra's eyes. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to consider that maybe this situation broke something in both of you, revealed something about how fragile civility is, how quickly we can become the worst versions of ourselves when we're tired, overworked, undervalued." Sandra felt anger rising in her chest. "Are you seriously comparing my being rude to a customer with him systematically destroying my life?" Patricia shook her head quickly. "No, of course not. The scale is completely different. But the impulse, the underlying wound, maybe that's the same. You were exhausted and underpaid and treated him like he was invisible. He was exhausted and under pressure and treated you like you were expendable. Neither of you saw the other as fully human in that moment, and look what happened." The words hung in the air, uncomfortable and true. Sandra wanted to reject them, to hold on to the clear narrative where she was purely victim and Marcus purely villain. But life rarely offered such clean distinctions. She thought about her own behavior that Tuesday afternoon, not to excuse Marcus's actions, but to honestly assess her own. She'd been cruel, not illegal, not criminal, but cruel nonetheless. And cruelty, she was learning, had consequences that rippled far beyond the moment of their creation. "Why are you really here?" Sandra asked finally. Patricia pulled out a folder from her bag. "Because the investigation into Hoskins is falling apart, and I think you might be the only person who can save it." She spread documents across the table. "You worked for him for 8 years. You signed off on reports, handled deposits, managed inventory. You were doing what you were told, but you also saw things. Patterns, inconsistencies, moments that didn't add up. Marcus's misconduct doesn't erase Hoskins's crimes. But if we can't corroborate the evidence independently, he's going to walk. And dozens of workers who were systematically cheated out of wages will get nothing." Sandra stared at the documents, seeing her own signature repeated across forms and reports that had been used to build a case against her. The irony was almost too perfect. The evidence that had been weaponized to destroy her life was now being offered back as a tool for justice. "You want me to testify against Hoskins?" Patricia nodded. "Voluntarily, with full immunity and with a guarantee that all charges against you are permanently dropped." Plus, there's a fund being established for workers affected by wage theft. You'd be entitled to back pay, probably significant. It was exactly the kind of offer Sandra had dreamed about during those dark weeks of unemployment and desperation. Justice, vindication, and financial stability all wrapped in a neat legal package. But it came with a cost. Testifying meant reliving every moment of the investigation, meant facing cross-examination from defense attorneys who would paint her as a vindictive woman trying to save herself by blaming her former boss. It meant more media attention, more scrutiny, more of her life held up for public consumption and judgment. "I need to think about it," Sandra said. Patricia nodded, standing to leave. "Take your time, but not too much time. Hoskins's lawyers are pushing for dismissal based on investigative misconduct. If we don't move quickly, this whole thing disappears." She paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Sorry for what Marcus did. Sorry for my part in it. Sorry that trying to make things right requires asking even more from you." After Patricia left, Sandra sat at the table for a long time, surrounded by documents that represented years of her labor, her signatures, her complicity in a system she hadn't fully understood. Her sister, Rachel, came in from putting the kids to bed. What did she want? Sandra explained the offer, the testimony, the immunity. Rachel sat down heavily. "So now they want you to clean up their mess. After they nearly destroyed you, now they need you to save their case." "It's not just their case," Sandra said slowly, seeing the situation from a new angle. "Those workers, the ones Hoskins cheated, a lot of them are people I worked with. Maria, who has 3 kids and was always short on her paycheck but never complained because she couldn't afford to lose her job. James, who worked doubles because his wife was sick and Hoskins promised overtime pay that never materialized. If I don't testify, they get nothing. Hoskins wins, and he'll just do it again somewhere else." Rachel reached across the table and took her sister's hand. "You don't owe these people anything. After what they put you through, you could walk away and no one would blame you." Sandra squeezed back, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on her shoulders. "Maybe that's exactly why I should do it. Not for them, not for Marcus or Patricia or the Department of Labor, but because I know what it feels like to be powerless, to have your life in someone else's hands, to be treated like you're disposable. If I can stop that from happening to someone else, don't I have to try?" The question echoed in the small kitchen, profound and impossible. Sandra thought about that Tuesday afternoon, about the man in the grey hoodie and the contempt she'd shown him, about how one moment of casual cruelty had cascaded into this sprawling catastrophe that had somehow, impossibly, circled back to offer her a chance at redemption. Not for Marcus, who had his own reckoning to face, but for herself. A chance to be more than a victim or a villain, to be someone who chose justice even when justice had not been chosen for her. She picked up her phone and called Michael Torres. "I want to testify," she said when he answered, "but on my terms. I'll tell the truth about Hoskins, about the wage theft, about everything I saw. But I also want to talk about what happened with Marcus, about the system that allowed one agent's personal vendetta to nearly destroy an entire case. Someone needs to make sure this can't happen again." Michael was quiet for a moment, then she heard the smile in his voice. "I'll set up the meeting. But Sandra, you should know once you open this door, there's no going back. Your life becomes public record. Every mistake, every moment, it all becomes part of the story." Sandra looked around her sister's kitchen, at the life she'd been forced to rebuild from ashes, at the uncertain future stretching before her like a road through fog. "My life already is public record. At least this way, I get to tell the story myself." The deposition room was smaller than Sandra had imagined. Somehow, in her mind, official federal proceedings happened in grand spaces, with vaulted ceilings and mahogany panels. But this was just a windowless conference room on the third floor of a government building. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a long table scarred with coffee rings, and a court reporter sitting in the corner with hands poised over a stenotype machine. Sandra sat with Michael on her left and Patricia Reeves across from her, along with two attorneys from the U.S. Attorney's Office who'd introduced themselves with names she immediately forgot. Her hands were folded on the table, still and controlled, but her right foot tapped an anxious rhythm against the floor that she couldn't quite stop. "Before we begin," said the older attorney, a woman named Diane something, "I want to be absolutely clear about what you're agreeing to. Your testimony will be used to prosecute Gerald Hoskins for wage theft, fraud, and labor violations. In exchange, all charges against you are dropped, and you receive full immunity for any involvement, knowing or unknowing, in the fraudulent activities. You'll also be entitled to compensation from the Workers' Restitution Fund. Do you understand?" Sandra nodded. "I understand. And you're aware that defense counsel will have the opportunity to cross-examine you?" Sandra's jaw tightened. "I'm aware." Diane studied her for a moment, perhaps looking for signs of weakness or hesitation, then nodded to the court reporter. "Let's begin. Please state your full name for the record." "Sandra Marie Mitchell." "And how long were you employed at Burger Haven location 774? 8 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The specificity of the answer made everyone in the room pause. Sandra hadn't planned to be so precise, but the numbers had been carved into her memory during sleepless nights of adding and subtracting, trying to calculate what those years had been worth. Diane recovered first. "During that time, did you have regular interaction with the franchise owner, Gerald Hoskins?" "Yes. He came by the location at least twice a week, more during inventory periods or when there were issues with corporate. And did you ever witness Mr. Hoskins engaging in activities that seemed unusual or improper?" Sandra took a breath, reaching back through 8 years of memories that she'd spent months trying to forget. "He had a system," she began, her voice gaining strength. "Inventory would come in, but the delivery slips wouldn't match what was actually received. He'd sign off on full shipments, but only stock partial amounts. The difference would go to his other locations, off the books. When I asked about it once, early on, he told me it was a efficiency strategy, a way to manage surplus. I didn't question it again. Why not?" Sandra met Diane's eyes directly. "Because I needed the job. Because I was a single mother with 2 kids and no backup plan. Because questioning the boss is how you get your hours cut or your schedule changed to all closing shifts. Because I'd learned a long time ago that survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut." The honesty in the room was uncomfortable, too raw for the sterile setting. Patricia shifted in her seat. One of the junior attorneys made a note. Diane pressed on. "Did Mr. Hoskins ever instruct you to alter documents or misrepresent information?" "Not directly. He'd say things like, make sure the deposit matches corporate expectations, or adjust the timesheet total so we don't trigger overtime alerts. He never said falsify or lie. He didn't have to. The implication was always clear." "And did you adjust those records?" This was the moment Sandra had been dreading, the question that turned her from witness to accomplice. "Yes. I signed off on reports that I knew weren't completely accurate. I processed deposits that had been manipulated. I scheduled employees just under the overtime threshold, even when they'd worked more hours. I did what I was told because I was afraid of losing my job. And I convinced myself that everyone did it, that this was just how the industry worked. But you knew it was wrong." Sandra's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I knew it wasn't right. I don't know if I let myself acknowledge it was wrong. There's a difference. Wrong means you have a choice and you make the bad one. What I felt was more like I was trapped in a system where all the choices were bad, and I picked the one that let me keep feeding my kids." The deposition continued for 3 hours. Sandra walked them through payroll manipulation, inventory fraud, and systematic wage theft that had affected dozens of employees across multiple years. She provided dates, amounts, names of workers who'd been cheated. With each revelation, the case against Hoskins grew stronger, but so did Sandra's own culpability. She was testifying against him, yes, but she was also testifying against herself, admitting to years of complicity that had seemed like survival at the time, but now felt like betrayal of everyone she'd worked alongside. When they finally finished, Sandra felt hollowed out, as if she'd excavated herself from the inside. Michael walked her to her car, his hand light on her shoulder. "You did good in there. Really good. This testimony will make the case." Sandra unlocked her car but didn't get in. "I helped him steal from people who had even less than I did. How is that good?" "You were a victim too," Michael said. "Hoskins exploited your vulnerability. You're not responsible for his crimes." But Sandra shook her head. "I'm responsible for my part in them. Immunity doesn't change what I did. It just means I won't go to jail for it." She drove home through late afternoon traffic, the city blurring past her windows like a painting left out in the rain. 200 miles north, Marcus stood on the porch of his grandfather's cabin, watching snow begin to fall. His phone, which he'd finally turned back on, had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Most were from reporters, a few from former colleagues, one from his mother asking if he was still alive. He'd responded to that one, a brief message assuring her he was fine, though fine seemed like a word from a foreign language he'd forgotten how to speak. He'd been following the news coverage of Sandra's testimony through a laptop with spotty satellite internet. The headlines painted her as everything from hero to hypocrite, savior to conspirator. Comment sections were brutal, thousands of strangers debating whether she deserved redemption or punishment, whether her cooperation was courage or cowardice. Marcus recognized the pattern because he'd been through it himself weeks earlier. The internet loved a morality play, but had no patience for moral complexity. What haunted him most was a quote from Sandra's testimony that had been picked up by several news outlets. "I did what I was told because I was afraid of losing my job, and I convinced myself that everyone did it, that this was just how the industry worked." He'd read that line a dozen times, each time seeing his own reflection in her words. Hadn't he done the same thing? Convinced himself that bending rules was acceptable as long as it served a larger purpose? That the ends justified the means? That everyone in law enforcement occasionally let personal feelings influence professional judgment? The snow fell harder, accumulating in drifts against the cabin walls. Marcus went inside and built up the fire, then sat at his grandfather's old desk and pulled out a notebook. He'd been writing, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to understand the exact moment when he'd stopped being an agent serving justice and become an instrument of revenge. The transformation hadn't been sudden. It had been gradual, incremental, a series of small compromises that had accumulated until he no longer recognized himself. He wrote, "I told myself Sandra deserved investigation because rude people usually have something to hide. I told myself I was being thorough, not vindictive. I told myself that if the investigation revealed crimes, then my initial motivation didn't matter. But I was lying. I knew I was lying. And I kept lying until the lies became truth in my own mind." His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Hello? Agent Chen? My name is Maria Gonzalez. You don't know me, but you investigated the place where I worked, Burger Haven on 15th Street. Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. "I'm not an agent anymore." "I know. I've been following the news. I'm calling because I want to thank you." The words were so unexpected that Marcus couldn't process them. "Thank me?" "For telling the truth. For your confession. Because of you coming forward, they're investigating our wage theft claims. I'm going to get back pay for 3 years of stolen overtime. That's almost $12,000. My daughter needs surgery that we couldn't afford. Now we can do it." Her voice cracked slightly. "I know you did something wrong. I know you hurt Sandra. But you also did something right by admitting it. That's more than most people with power ever do." Marcus sat in silence after the call ended, Maria's gratitude sitting uncomfortably in his chest. He'd destroyed one life and inadvertently improved another. The moral arithmetic couldn't balance, but it existed nonetheless. He thought about calling Sandra, but what would he say? That a stranger had thanked him for ruining her life in service of accidentally helping others? That his confession had been self-serving but had somehow contributed to justice anyway? That he was sorry, endlessly sorry, but sorry changed nothing? Back in the city, Sandra's testimony had leaked. Not officially, but in the way these things always leaked, through courthouse gossip and legal assistant networks and journalists with good sources. The details spread across social media, and with them came a new wave of attention. Sandra's phone rang constantly. Her sister's address, which she'd tried to keep private, was posted online. Photographers camped outside, hoping for a shot of the woman at the center of the scandal. Emma, her 12-year-old daughter, found her mother crying in the bathroom at 2 in the morning. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sandra wiped her eyes quickly, trying to hide the evidence of her breakdown, but Emma was too perceptive. She sat on the bathroom floor next to her mother, not saying anything, just being present. After a long silence, Sandra spoke. "I thought doing the right thing would feel better than this." "Is it the right thing?" Emma asked. Sandra looked at her daughter, surprised by the question. "Testifying against Hoskins, yes, I think so. But you also did bad things, didn't you? The things you testified about?" Sandra nodded slowly. "Yes, I did. I helped him, even though I didn't want to, even though I knew it was wrong." Emma processed this with the stark clarity of youth. "So you're helping catch a bad guy, but you were kind of bad too?" Sandra felt tears threatening again. "Yes, that's exactly it. People aren't just good or bad, sweetie. We're complicated. We make mistakes. We hurt people even when we don't mean to. And sometimes, trying to fix one mistake means admitting to others." "What about the man who investigated you, the agent?" Emma had followed the story more closely than Sandra had realized. "Is he good or bad?" The question hung in the small bathroom, reflecting off tile and mirror. Sandra thought about Marcus Chen, about the man who'd weaponized his authority over a moment of rudeness, who'd confessed his misconduct when he could have stayed silent, who'd triggered a chain of events that had simultaneously destroyed and saved her. "I don't know," she said finally. "I think maybe he's just human, like the rest of us." The trial date for Gerald Hoskins was set for January, 6 weeks away. Sandra would be the prosecution's key witness. Marcus would likely be called by the defense to testify about investigative misconduct, his confession used to undermine the entire case. They would see each other again, in a courtroom under oath, forced to relive the choices that had brought them both to ruin. But before that could happen, something shifted. 3 days after Sandra's deposition, Michael Torres received a call from Hoskins's defense attorney. They wanted to discuss a plea agreement. The evidence was too strong, the testimony too damaging, the public attention too intense. Hoskins was willing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a lighter sentence and immediate payment into the workers' restitution fund. It should have felt like victory. Justice served, workers compensated, bad guy punished. But as Sandra sat in Michael's office, listening to him explain the plea terms, all she felt was empty. There would be no trial, no public accountability, no moment of courtroom drama where truth prevailed and righteousness triumphed. Just a negotiated settlement, a legal compromise that satisfied no one completely, but ended the matter efficiently. "Is this what justice looks like?" Sandra asked. Michael leaned back in his chair. Sometimes, not the justice we see in movies, but the kind that actually happens in the real world. Messy, incomplete, better than nothing but worse than we hoped for. Sandra drove home as dusk settled over the city, streetlights flickering on in sequence like dominoes falling. She thought about Maria Gonzalez getting money for her daughter's surgery, about the dozens of other workers who would receive compensation they'd been owed. She thought about Emma's question, about good and bad and all the impossible space between. She thought about Marcus in his cabin, writing in notebooks, trying to understand what he'd become. And she realized that the story wasn't over. Not really, because stories like this never end cleanly. They echoed forward, rippling through lives and choices, changing everyone they touched in ways both visible and hidden. Tomorrow, she would accept the plea agreement. Next week, she would receive her immunity paperwork. Next month, the restitution check would arrive. And then what? Then she would have to figure out how to live with everything she'd done and everything that had been done to her. How to be both victim and perpetrator. How to accept grace she wasn't sure she deserved. The snow that had started in the mountains was moving toward the city. Weather reports warning of the season's first major storm. Sandra watched the sky darken, felt the temperature drop, and wondered if Marcus was watching the same approaching weather. If he was thinking about her the way she was thinking about him. Two strangers connected by cruelty and consequence, forever bound by the moment when their worst selves had collided and set fire to both their lives. The storm hit the city 3 days before Christmas. Not the gentle postcard snow that makes everything feel magical, but the brutal kind that shuts down highways and traps people in their homes. Sandra watched it through her sister's living room window, coffee going cold in her hands, while Emma and Jacob built a blanket fort in the corner. The immunity papers sat on the kitchen table, signed and notarized. The restitution check was in her account. Legally, officially, the nightmare was over. So why did she still feel like she was drowning? Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She'd learned to ignore most calls, but something made her answer this one. Hello? Silence on the other end, then breathing. Then a voice she recognized immediately, despite having heard it only once, months ago in a deposition room recording. This is Marcus Chen. I know I have no right to call you. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to tell you something before the plea goes through tomorrow. Sandra's grip tightened on the phone. She should hang up. She should block the number. She should protect herself from whatever new damage this man could inflict. Instead, she said, I'm listening. I've been offered a deal, Marcus said, his voice raw with something that might have been shame or exhaustion or both. The department wants to sweep this under the rug. Early retirement, full pension, confidentiality agreement. They'll frame my resignation as voluntary, no admission of wrongdoing in official records. In exchange, I don't testify at Hoskins's sentencing. I don't talk to the media. I disappear quietly and let everyone move on. Sandra felt her pulse quicken. And you called to tell me you're taking it. I called to tell you I'm not. The words came out like a confession. I'm refusing the deal. I'm going to testify at the sentencing hearing. I'm going to tell the judge exactly what I did. How I manipulated the investigation. How my personal vendetta contaminated the case. It won't change Hoskins's sentence, but it needs to be in the public record. The system that allowed this to happen needs to be exposed. Why? The question escaped before Sandra could stop it. Why would you destroy what's left of your life for that? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Because you did. You testified when you could have walked away. You told the truth even though it destroyed you. I watched you do that from a distance and realized I was still taking the coward's way out. I confessed, yes, but only privately. Only to the minimum extent necessary. I've been hiding in this cabin, telling myself I'd paid my dues, but I haven't. Not really. Sandra closed her eyes, processing this information through layers of anger and exhaustion. You want my forgiveness. That's why you're calling. No, Marcus said, and there was something honest in his voice that made her believe him. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that what you did mattered. Your courage mattered. It changed something in me, made me see that real accountability isn't about legal immunity or plea deals. It's about standing in front of everyone and saying, this is what I did. This is who I was. I can't undo it, but I won't hide from it. The call ended, and Sandra stood at the window watching snow pile against the glass. Emma appeared at her side. Was that him? The agent? Sandra nodded. Emma took her mother's hand. Are you glad he called? I don't know, Sandra said honestly. Ask me again in a year. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the day after Christmas, a deliberate choice to minimize media attention during the holiday lull. But word had spread anyway, rumors about Marcus Chen's planned testimony, speculation about what revelations might emerge. The courthouse steps were lined with cameras despite the cold, reporters stamping their feet and clutching coffee cups, waiting for someone to arrive who could give them a quote. Sandra came early with Michael Torres, slipping in through a side entrance. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, wood-paneled and formal, with rows of benches mostly empty. Hoskins sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than Sandra made in 3 months, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't look at her when she entered. She was grateful for that. Marcus arrived last, walking in just as the proceedings were about to begin. He wore a dark suit, his face thinner than Sandra remembered from that October afternoon. Their eyes met across the courtroom for just a second. No acknowledgement, no signal, just that brief connection that contained everything they'd been through and everything they'd lost. The judge, an older woman named Constance Rivera, called the hearing to order. Hoskins's guilty plea was formally entered. The prosecutor outlined the charges, the stolen wages, the systematic fraud that had affected 47 workers across 8 years. The defense attorney made a statement about his client's remorse, his willingness to make restitution, his value to the community. It was all so procedural, so divorced from the actual human damage that Sandra felt disconnected from the entire process. Then Judge Rivera said, I understand we have testimony regarding investigative irregularities. Mr. Chen, please approach. Marcus stood and walked to the witness stand. He was sworn in, stated his name and former position, and then Judge Rivera leaned forward. Mr. Chen, you've waived your Fifth Amendment rights and requested to testify today. Please explain why. Marcus took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the courtroom with startling clarity. Your Honor, I initiated the investigation that led to Mr. Hoskins's arrest. But I did so not because of evidence of wrongdoing, but because one of his employees was rude to me. I then manipulated investigative priorities and evidence review to target that employee, Sandra Mitchell, in what amounted to an abuse of federal authority. My actions nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life and compromised the integrity of this entire case. The courtroom went utterly silent. Even the court reporter seemed to pause. Marcus continued, his testimony detailed and unflinching. He described the encounter at Burger Haven, his emotional reaction, the deliberate choice to escalate Sandra's role in the investigation. He explained how easy it had been to weaponize the system, how little oversight existed for agents in the field, how personal bias could masquerade as professional judgment with almost no accountability. I'm testifying today, Marcus said, because the plea agreement currently before this court was built on a foundation of misconduct that I initiated and perpetuated. While Mr. Hoskins is guilty of the crimes he's pleading to, the public deserves to know that the investigation was tainted from its inception. The workers who were victimized deserve to know that justice in their case came not because the system worked, but because it failed and then was forced to correct itself through confession. Judge Rivera listened without expression, but Sandra saw her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. When Marcus finished, she said, Mr. Chen, you understand that your testimony today will likely result in criminal charges against you for abuse of authority and official misconduct? Yes, Your Honor, I understand. And you're making this statement voluntarily without any agreement for immunity or reduced charges? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Rivera leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with an expression that might have been respect or might have been contempt. Your honesty is noted, though it comes remarkably late in the process. You may step down. The prosecutor stood, clearly thrown by Marcus's testimony. Your Honor, the government's position on Mr. Hoskins's sentencing remains unchanged. While we acknowledge investigative irregularities, the evidence of his guilt is overwhelming and independent of any single agent's misconduct. But Judge Rivera raised her hand. I'm not prepared to accept this plea as structured. I'm ordering a 30-day continuance to review the case file in light of Mr. Chen's testimony. Both parties will submit briefs addressing how investigative misconduct impacted evidence collection and case development. We'll reconvene on January 28th. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. Hoskins's attorney was on his feet objecting. The prosecutor looked stricken. Reporters rushed for the doors, phones already out, typing furiously. Sandra sat frozen, watching it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment. Michael leaned over. This is good for you. It means more scrutiny on the investigation, more chance to expose what really happened. But Sandra wasn't thinking about what was good for her. She was watching Marcus being escorted from the courtroom by 2 federal marshals, presumably to begin whatever legal process awaited him now. He'd just committed professional suicide on the witness stand. He'd sacrificed the last remnants of his career, his reputation, his freedom, all to tell a truth that might not even change the outcome of the case. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the city wrapped in white silence. Sandra stood on the courthouse steps, ignoring the reporters shouting questions, watching Marcus being led to an unmarked car. He looked up once, found her in the crowd, and there was something in his expression that transcended words. Not forgiveness requested or granted, but recognition. 2 people who'd been ground up by a system they'd both served and failed, who'd found each other on the other side of ruin, changed in ways neither could have predicted. That night, Sandra couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Marcus's testimony, the precise way he described his own misconduct, sparing himself nothing. She thought about courage and how many forms it took. It was courageous to testify against Hoskins, yes, but it was something else entirely to testify against yourself, to publicly dismantle your own justifications and stand naked before judgment. She found herself at her laptop at 3 a.m, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then she started typing. Not a statement, not a press release, but an essay. About rudeness and consequences, about systems that dehumanize everyone who moves through them. About 2 people who'd wounded each other and then had to decide whether to stay wounded or to try something harder. She wrote about working in the service industry, about the daily erasure of being treated as less than human by people who never thought twice about their casual cruelty. She wrote about understanding, finally, that Marcus had been wrong, but that she hadn't been entirely right either. I was rude that day, she wrote. Not illegal, not criminal, but cruel in the casual way we're all cruel when we're exhausted and overworked and have forgotten how to see strangers as fully human. What happened to me afterward was disproportionate, unjust, an abuse of power that nearly destroyed my life. But the seed of it, the initial wound that came from my own hardened heart. We can acknowledge both truths. We can say that what Marcus did was wrong, while also saying that the culture that made me so bitter I couldn't show basic kindness to a stranger is also wrong. We can believe in accountability while also believing in complexity. She posted it on Medium at dawn, expecting nothing. By noon, it had been shared 30,000 times. By evening, it was trending on social media. The essay resonated because it refused easy answers, because it insisted on holding multiple truths simultaneously, because it was written by someone who'd lived through the consequences and emerged with wisdom instead of rage. Marcus read it from a holding cell, waiting for his arraignment on federal misconduct charges. Someone had printed it out and passed it to him, a gesture of kindness from a guard who'd followed the story. He read Sandra's words 3 times, tears streaming down his face, understanding finally what redemption might look like. Not erasure of what he'd done, not even forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of being seen in full, his worst actions and his attempt at accountability, and being recognized as human despite it all. The essay changed the conversation. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about a corrupt agent and a victimized worker. It was about systems that break people down, about the cost of service work in America, about how power can corrupt even those who think they're serving justice, about the complicated relationship between accountability and grace. Judge Rivera read it too, and when she reconvened the hearing in late January, her ruling reflected its influence. She accepted Hoskins's plea, but delivered a scathing rebuke from the bench about working conditions that dehumanize employees and enforcement systems that enable abuse. She ordered additional restitution payments and mandatory labor practice reforms for all franchise locations. And she announced that Marcus Chen's case would be handled by a special prosecutor focused on law enforcement accountability, setting a precedent that federal agents could be held criminally responsible for abuse of authority. Sandra and Marcus didn't speak at that hearing. But as they left the courthouse through different exits, each walking into uncertain futures shaped by the choices they'd made and the consequences they'd accepted, something had shifted. Not healing exactly, not closure, but the beginning of understanding. The recognition that damage done can't be undone, but it can be acknowledged, learned from, transformed into something that might prevent the next person from falling into the same trap. The restitution money had given Sandra breathing room she'd never had before. Not wealth, nothing close to wealth, but the ability to fix the car without panic, to say yes when the kids asked for new shoes, to sleep without that constant low-grade terror of financial collapse. She'd put some away for their college funds, knowing even as she did it that it wouldn't be enough. But it was something. A foundation. A beginning. Marcus Chen pleaded guilty to official misconduct and abuse of authority. The judge, showing unexpected leniency given the circumstances, sentenced him to 1 year in federal prison, followed by 3 years probation and permanent disqualification from law enforcement. It was less than many thought he deserved and more than some thought was fair. He served 8 months before being released for good behavior, emerging into a world that had largely forgotten him while he was inside. He returned to his grandfather's cabin, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he'd found something like peace in its isolation. He took a job at a non-profit too, though a different one than Sandra's, working with a criminal justice reform organization that trained former law enforcement officers to advocate for systemic change. It was uncomfortable work, constantly confronting people who'd once been colleagues, explaining over and over how easy it was to abuse power when systems lacked accountability. But discomfort, Marcus had learned, was the price of growth. They didn't see each other during those months. There were no dramatic reunions, no carefully orchestrated meetings. Their lives had intersected catastrophically and then diverged, each pursuing separate paths toward something that resembled recovery. But they thought about each other, the way people do when they've been fundamentally changed by an encounter, when someone else's existence has permanently altered their understanding of themselves. The question that had opened this story, the one that seemed so simple at the beginning, echoed differently now. Why would a simple fast food order lead to a federal investigation that would destroy one woman's life forever? The answer wasn't what anyone expected. It didn't lead to permanent destruction. It led to transformation, painful and unwanted, and ultimately necessary. It revealed how fragile civilization is, how quickly we can hurt each other when we forget to see each other as human, How systems we trust can be weaponized by wounded egos and unchecked power. But it also revealed something else. That confession has power. That accountability matters. That even people who've done terrible things can choose to stop running from what they've done and instead turn to face it. That victims can become advocates. That perpetrators can become reformers. That the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, and we're all capable of crossing it in either direction. Emma would grow up watching her mother transform pain into purpose, learning that strength isn't the absence of damage, but what you build from the broken pieces. Jacob would remember the year everything fell apart and came back together as the year he learned that fairness and justice aren't the same thing, but both matter. Marcus would spend the rest of his life trying to prevent other agents from making his mistakes, knowing he could never erase what he'd done, but refusing to let it be meaningless. And somewhere in the complicated space between mercy and judgment, between consequence and grace, between the people we are in our worst moments and the people we become when we choose growth over comfort, the real story lived. Not in headlines or court transcripts, but in small daily choices to be kinder than necessary, more honest than convenient, more accountable than required. The final question wasn't whether Sandra and Marcus found peace or happiness or redemption in any traditional sense. The final question was simpler and more profound. When you discover you're capable of both cruelty and courage, of both inflicting harm and creating healing, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you hide from it, deny it, let it paralyze you with shame? Or do you accept it, learn from it, use it to become someone who makes the world slightly less cruel than you found it? They chose the latter. Imperfectly, inconsistently, with setbacks and doubts and moments of profound discouragement. But they chose it nonetheless. And in a world that often feels irredeemably broken, that choice, repeated over and over by flawed people trying to do better, is what holds everything together. The sun set on that spring evening, casting long shadows across the parking lot where two strangers had once again become strangers, but different ones now, changed by fire, carrying scars that had become strange kinds of gifts. And the question that lingered, the one that follows us all, was this: if you knew that every small interaction could ripple outward into enormous consequence, if you truly understood that your worst moment could become someone else's defining trauma, would you treat strangers differently? Would you treat yourself differently? Would you recognize that accountability and compassion aren't opposites, but partners in the difficult work of being human? The story ended not with answers, but with choices, made daily, in the space between who we've been and who we're trying to become. And that perhaps was the only ending that mattered. Sandra thought about Marcus when she worked with clients who'd been targeted by vindictive enforcement actions, when she saw how easily the machinery of justice could be turned toward revenge. She thought about him when she caught herself being short with a slow customer at the grocery store, when she felt that old impatience rising and had to consciously choose kindness instead. The awareness that small cruelties could cascade into life-destroying consequences had made her hyper-vigilant about her own behavior, sometimes exhaustingly so. Marcus thought about Sandra constantly during his incarceration. He'd written her letters he never sent, apologies that felt simultaneously necessary and insufficient. In prison, surrounded by people who'd been failed by the system he'd served, he'd been forced to confront the comfortable distance he'd maintained between himself and the consequences of his work. Every person he met had a story about an agent or prosecutor or judge who'd seen them as cases instead of humans, who'd let bias or exhaustion or personal grievance influence their decisions. He was one of many, he realized, not an aberration but a symptom. 1 year to the day after that December sentencing hearing, an event was held at the community center. A celebration, they called it, marking the distribution of the final restitution payments to workers affected by Hoskins's wage theft. Maria Gonzalez spoke, her daughter healthy after surgery, her voice breaking as she thanked everyone who'd fought for justice. Other workers shared their stories, The overtime they'd been denied, the hours they'd worked off the clock, the tips that had been stolen, the dreams they'd deferred because money that should have been theirs had been taken. Sandra attended, sitting in the back row, listening to these stories with a complicated mix of emotions. She'd been part of the system that enabled this theft, however unwittingly. She'd signed the forms, processed the deposits, kept the machine running even as it ground people down. Yes, she'd also been victimized by it. Yes, she'd ultimately helped dismantle it. But the complicity remained, an uncomfortable truth she'd learned to carry. Marcus attended too, though he stayed outside in the parking lot, unable to bring himself to walk through the doors. He'd been invited, surprisingly, by Michael Torres, who'd developed a strange respect for him during the legal proceedings. "You should be there," Michael had said. "Not to be celebrated, but to witness what your confession helped achieve. The harm you caused was real, but so was the good that came from your accountability." So Marcus stood in the parking lot, watching through the windows as people celebrated, and felt the weight of everything settle on his shoulders in a way that was almost comforting. This was his life now, forever on the outside of the things he'd set in motion, forever carrying the knowledge of what he'd done, forever trying to balance the scales, even though they could never truly balance. Sandra saw him there as she was leaving. She recognized his silhouette immediately. That same deliberate stillness he'd had in the burger joint all those months ago. She could have walked past, gotten in her car, driven away without acknowledgement. It would have been easier, but she'd learned that easier wasn't always better. She walked over slowly, and Marcus turned to face her. For a long moment, they simply stood there in the spring evening, the sound of celebration drifting from the building behind them, the smell of fresh-cut grass in the air. Then Sandra spoke. "Thank you for testifying, for telling the truth when you could have hidden." Marcus shook his head. "I don't deserve thanks. I only told the truth after lying for months, after destroying your life." "You didn't destroy it," Sandra said, and she was surprised to realize she meant it. "You broke it, yes. You caused enormous damage, but I rebuilt it. And it's different now. In some ways better. I understand things I didn't before. About power, about systems, about my own capacity for both cruelty and resilience. I wouldn't have chosen this path, but I can acknowledge what I've learned from it." "Does that mean you forgive me?" Marcus asked quietly, and Sandra saw the desperate hope in his face, the need for absolution. "No," she said, and watched that hope die. "I don't forgive you. Maybe someday, but not yet. Forgiveness isn't something you earn by apologizing or even by facing consequences. It's something that happens when the wound stops defining you, when you can think about the person who hurt you without feeling that pain all over again. I'm not there yet." Marcus nodded, accepting this without argument. "Then what do we do now?" Sandra considered the question, looking at this man who'd been both her destroyer and inadvertent savior, who'd taught her lessons she'd never wanted to learn, but desperately needed to know. "We do the work," she said finally. "We wake up every day and try to be better than we were. We help people who are going through what we went through. We refuse to let bitterness turn us into worse versions of ourselves. We remember what we did and what was done to us, and we use that memory to make different choices." "That's all?" Marcus asked. "Just keep going, keep trying?" "That's everything," Sandra replied. "That's the only thing any of us can do." They stood together for a few more minutes, not friends but not quite enemies either. Two people connected by damage and accountability, by the ways they'd wounded each other, and the ways they'd grown from those wounds. Then Sandra got in her car, and Marcus walked back to his truck, and they drove away in different directions, carrying their stories forward into whatever came next. In the months and years that followed, they would occasionally cross paths at conferences or community events, would exchange brief nods of recognition that contained entire conversations. They would watch each other's work from a distance, Sandra's advocacy expanding to statewide initiatives, Marcus's writing about law enforcement reform gaining unexpected traction. They would never be close, would never fully trust each other, but they would become living proof that people could survive their worst moments and still find ways to contribute something meaningful to the world.